Yeah, and I think I heard you talking about, or maybe I read it in part of your book, was this idea that people are moving in the system. And I've taught Leviticus how many times, and I taught through this, but I never had put it so succinctly. People are moving in and out of impurity all the time.
Precisely.
People are moving in and out of the need, and impurity is not necessarily a moral issue, but they're also moving in and out of the need for forgiveness from God at all times. And so this is a very fluid situation. It's rather than a series of 619 check boxes, right?
Right. No, exactly, Drew. That's exactly right. I mean, you're slipping in and out of impurity all the time. Becoming impure is not this grave, frustrating thing, unless you're like literally on your way to the temple to offer a sacrifice, and then someone, whatever, defiles you accidentally. Then you would probably, give an eye roll and be like, now I gotta go, bathe, and I gotta wait till sundown. Now I can't make this offering until tomorrow.
It's a pain, yeah.
Right, but just like if you're up in Galilee and whatever, it's just, I don't know. I can't psychologize them. I'll psychologize myself. If I were living within this system, I would probably just kind of assume I was in a state of impurity until proven otherwise. Unless I bathed and was clean by sundown, then went to bed and didn't do anything, and then woke up and didn't see or touch anybody. Then I know. But like as soon as you're out in the crowd, like you're jostling with people. You don't know what . And so I just think that it's just such a mundane, routine aspect of life that people think of as this insurmountable thing. Like, oh, you could never know. You'd be so nervous about it all the time. And now the problem with this, of course, is that once you've associated ritual purity with this really grave, serious thing, and then you've seen that people like the Pharisees are, interested in maintaining ritual impurity, it's easy to then imagine them as just being like this certain kind of annoying, intense person who would never talk with anybody else, and would like not touch anybody in the streets or something like that, and walk, make sure that you like
Taliban enforcers or something.
Yeah, and I just think like, man, what an overread. Like they're part of the people. They're super popular. They're in the crowds. Like I find it just such an overcooking of the evidence. And then the problem with it is that it inscribes a view in which like the Pharisees, because they're so into ritual purity, they must be a kind of like annoying personality. Right. So then this gets put to work in readings like Marcus Borg and others, where they describe the Pharisaic purity as basically being like anti-compassionate. And that like when Jesus is healing people with impurity, he even says that when Jesus heals the guy with lepra, it's an anti-Pharisaic. That healing had an anti-Pharisaic front. And I just find that astounding, right? He's quoting somebody else, but he endorses the claim. Anyway, I just think that it's not just about, okay, well, let's understand ritual impurity better. You have to understand it better so that you don't sort of have these really weird misreadings in which you inscribe a certain kind of personality or character to Jews or Judaism or the Pharisees, and then think that that's what Jesus is opposing. Right. Anyway.
And I think it's, everybody shares the blame in some of these caricatures and misunderstandings, but certainly the pulpit is a place where it's very easy just to say, here's the bad guys, here's how Jesus has come here to release you or to defeat the bad guys.
Yep.
And then you just point out simple things like, well, Paul's a Pharisee, and he doesn't quit identifying as a Pharisee. Even one of his last public statements is, "Hey, I'm a Pharisee." Like
right.
And you have Pharisees in the council at Acts who
it says, I was just teaching it yesterday. Some of the Pharisees who believe stood up and said this XYZ about circumcision, which means there's a group of believing Pharisees. Some of them thought the Gentiles ought to be circumcised, and some didn't. So you have believing Pharisees who already were not the people who were proposing Gentile circumcision, and so it's just.
And
those details are important. Sorry, what?
They don't renounce their identification.
Exactly, they don't renounce their identification of the Pharisees, and the council doesn't go with those guys. Doesn't agree with them. And then it says everyone agrees. Right? Obviously, whatever you think. The point is that like those details are often just kind of glossed over in a hurried attempt because of our recognition that, well, yeah, Pharisees, like, they're the kind of guys, they walk on the stage, everyone boos and throws a tomato or something, right? You already know, right? They're the villain. Yeah.
And I think for me, it's actually an important issue for today because, as some of my Jewish friends will say, like the story of modern, Judaism that emerges from the 2nd, 3rd century is the Pharisees won. Basically, their style of Judaism essentially becomes the style of Judaism with lots of modifications along the way. And so if you take that view as a Christian against Pharisees, and then you look at modern day religious Jews who are practicing their religion, it's very easy to just go like, Pharisaical.
Sure.
It's even a curse or a byword.
Well, exactly. Pharisee or Pharisaical is a slur. And on top of it, again, I'm actually not a specialist with respect to the question of what degree actually is the Mishnah, the inheritance of, the deposit of the Pharisees. But let's take the supposition that it is, because that's what a lot of modern folks have. Well, then all of a sudden, if that's your supposition, then all of rabbinic Judaism represents the thing that Jesus criticized.
Right.
And then that's where, again, you just have, and then what does that do? That's a negative on its own, right? Because not only is then Jesus sort of criticizing, all of this stuff that I just think we don't actually have evidence that he's criticizing that, but also B, once that rabbinic Judaism is associated with what we might call like modern Jews or Judaism, well then you've got the situation in which, well, yeah, Jesus would critique all you guys for the same reasons. You're like, okay, that's strike 2. And then strike 3 is that that because rabbinic Judaism and the Mishnah and Talmud and everything else is rightly understood to be sort of, you when you read it, you can see, okay, yeah, these guys are really into debating Torah and details and all that sort of stuff. And if Jesus opposes that, then you might think, well, Jesus is opposed to all those sort of fine, detailed arguments, and he's really just cutting to the quick. And I think, actually, no. If you think that, you're going to miss some really important stuff. I actually think the Mark 7 piece is really important here, where he has got a fine-tuned understanding of ritual impurity and its directionality, and he's putting that to work in both why his disciples don't wash their hands and why and his instruction that impurity comes from the heart and not the mouth, etc. But also his argument about the Sabbath grain field stuff, when his disciples are plucking grain on the Sabbath and they get opposed by the Pharisees, and Jesus defends them. He defends them with like a kind of complex argument that assumes a sort of well-versed understanding of Torah regulations and Scripture generally. Yeah. And honestly, like it's of course, I would think this. I because I'm a gospel scholar and I'm a Christian, but like, it's impressive, like it's when you see, you're like, okay, this is like he really knows his stuff. But if you've already assumed, of course, like but if you've already assumed that this is the sort of thing that Jesus doesn't do, right, because that's rabbinic Judaism. Well, then I think you're just gonna miss his actual argument, but also B, not miss that like he's actually working with that kind of legal reasoning. So anyway, yeah.
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters. Yeah, he has I have a book in the works where I'm trying to argue that Jesus actually learned Torah and he learned the legal reason of his day, and he is making very sophisticated slicing and dicing arguments between those two.
Sweet. Awesome. I can't wait to read it.
Probably not. I might just end up saying go read Paul's book instead. So
no.
It can be a short
yours.
book. Going back to Paul, I wonder what you make, or how do you teach this? That the last thing Paul does as a free guy is goes down to the temple to offer animal sacrifices as part of the Nazirite vow. Like, what do you? I think when I talk about this, most people are just like, wait, what?
Yeah, right.
Because you're possibly decades here after the resurrection of Jesus. So what do you do with that passage?
Yeah, great question, Drew. So in my book, Jesus and the Law of Moses, I don't I do address some of the Acts stuff, and I don't address that particular thing, I don't think. And then I also conclude with some stuff on Paul as to kind of give some sort of gesture toward how I'd handle some of the Pauline data. So what I do is I take a I think that Paul thinks that Jews are still expected to be Torah observant. I think this is arguable from his letters, like very plausibly arguable from his letters, and is utterly demonstrable according to Acts. Right. And so I think he thinks that, okay, everyone's just actually, now to even use the language of Acts 15, which I think is something I think I can translate well to Paul's letters. Both groups are saved by the grace of Jesus. That both groups are saved on the same bases, but that doesn't mean that they have identical obligations after that, and that the obligations, which again I use the word obligation very positively. I don't people hear that as a negative word. I don't use it that way. Have both, duties, responsibility, obligations. Have obligations that theoretically differ from one another, and that's fine. That's already baked into the Torah. Once you're in the Torah, right? It's already the case that differing parties have differing obligations, right? Not all Israel keeps all the commandments. If you're a non-priest and you try to keep the priestly commandments, that's transgression, bud. Right. Like you can't do it, right? And so you go on and on. So the point is I think, and similarly, like if you're a foreigner who lives in the land, like you don't have to obey all the commandments. It's not just that you don't have to. There are some that you cannot do. Like if you're an uncircumcised foreigner, you may not eat the Passover, right? I think that's how I read Paul, and I think that's what Acts 15 is doing as well. There's differing commandments. So then that's basically the principle. And I get there, by the way, in case people are curious. I'm not the first to argue this. That's been argued for decades by others. If you want the textual reason by that, I would take a look at 1 Corinthians 7, 19 and following. That's where I go from that, where he says, right, circumcision is nothing and foreskin is nothing, but what matters is keeping the commandments of God. And right before that, he'd said, like, look, if you were circumcised when called, then remain in the condition in which you were called, etc. And don't if you were circumcised, don't do an epispasm, don't undo your circumcision. And if you were called in foreskin, don't get circumcised. Let every man remain in the condition in which he was called, and in that condition, let him walk. And then he says, because circumcision is nothing, foreskin is nothing. What matters is keeping God's commands. It sounds like he's saying, all right, everyone stay how you were when you were called, and keep the commandments that obligate that social positioning. So then I go to Acts, and I think this is what's happening. He's a Jew. He's still subservient to Torah laws while he's operating in this realm, and if he's taken a Nazirite vow, then the legislation for that is that you offer, you do certain kind of shaving rites and make certain kind of sacrifices, and it just seems to me, it just is like it's really more of like I'd really kind of more like put the burden of proof on others. Like, what's the problem here? Like, I understand, I get it, I really do. I'm not trying to be silly about it. I get it, but at the same time, I start to think like, okay, wait, actually, I'd like you to tell me why you think this is a problem. Right. I feel like the burden of proof's on you, because why would like there's nothing sort of intrinsically that compromises salvation by grace through faith with the Messiah, and that you keep certain commandments. Like that there's just nothing intrinsically opposed to those things, and so, or oppositional between those claims. And so, I think he's making sacrifices. He thinks they're still legitimate, and I think that Jesus and Paul and probably the early apostles, along with actually a lot of other Jewish texts that have a restoration eschatology framework, I think that they think sacrifices couldn't get Israel out of the punitive discipline, right? If they violated the covenant and now they've got all this punitive discipline, sacrifice couldn't get them out of that. So if you're trying to offer a sacrifice to get yourself out of covenant wrath or whatever, then that's not how that works. You need just to endure the discipline, etc. But once you're within sort of a well operating machine, right? Sacrifices are just legitimate, and they work. And I guess the important point I'd say is they work and they do what they were designed to do.
Right.
So he took a Nazirite vow, which also, I assume he took a Nazirite vow. And I think that's what's going on in Acts 18, where he says he shaved his head because he was under a vow. There's only one vow that's associated with head shaving, and it's got to be the Nazirite vow. This tells you that he intentionally took a vow. That's a voluntary vow.
Right.
That means that he voluntarily took a vow which imposed upon himself, the requirement to be more scrupulous about his ritual purity, because you can't come into a contact with a corpse. And it required, he knew he'd have to go make a chatat, which is often rendered as the sin offering. Like, so he took a voluntary vow that he knew would make him subject to a higher degree of ritual purity and making sin offerings or chatats, purification offerings. So I just think that I think he thinks, hey, while I'm still in this moral realm where the law has its jurisdiction, I'm going to live my life according to that pattern, and so be it.
It's difficult to reconcile that Paul in Acts to a kind of Paul who's basically saying, this burden of the Torah is too much. This is what Christ came to relieve us from. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just don't read Paul that way.
Well, I think you're right in flipping the question. Like, what are you concerned about here? What's the problem? One area I do get a lot of concern, I say it kind of casually, and then I can see in my students or parishioners' faces where they're like, wait, what is, when you suggest that Jesus participated in the sacrificial system.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things where I don't know why, but people are just like, that's a no-go for them.
Right.
And they're like, well, how do you know he participated in this? I'm like, well, he was a Jew. Like he would.
Yeah. Right.
He breaks from his parents at Passover.
Right. He celebrated Passover. Yeah.
You think he's sitting on the side going like, no, none for me. I'm good.
Yeah. And he's
I got a meal coming later. You're gonna love. Right?
Exactly. Well, and even when you've got the Last Supper and it's the sort of thing that's, he's obviously imbuing it with another layer of significance. It's still the fact that they had to get the lamb, and so he sent people to prepare for it. I mean, like that's whatever you call it. It is participation in the sacrificial system.
Yeah.
Also, here's the understandable reason why I think people bump up against that, and I think it's the fact that they assume that all sacrifice is about sin, and so if all sacrifice is about sin, well then and Jesus was sinless. Well, of course he didn't ever participate in the sacrificial system. And all you have to do is just remind people that, no, that's not all that sacrifice is in for. In fact, actually, there's, the hatat and the guilt offering, the asham, and those are two of them. A lot of the others are just about, other things. You're fulfilling a vow. You're just expressing gratitude, whatever. I suspect Jesus never had to make a vow offering because I suspect he never made a vow.
Right.
But
he's pretty strong against them. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But I, or at least never made a vow that required sacrifice. But I don't know, did he ever just give an offering to express gratitude?
Yeah.
I don't see why that'd be problematic. Imagine 20-year-old Jesus who just just did that. I don't see why that's a problem. But anyway.